The color management settings in your grading system form the foundation of your Dolby Vision setup. Making sure your project is set up correctly for Dolby Vision and for your client's deliverable requirements is the first step to getting the most out of a Dolby Vision workflow. In this video, we'll go over common color management and video settings you'll need to get started.
Now, we'll be skipping a few steps here. We're going to assume you already installed your Dolby Vision license if you plan on using the additional trim controls. Licensing steps vary from software to software, but instructions will be provided when you receive a license from Dolby. So let's move on to our project setup in Resolve. After setting up essential project settings like resolution and frame rate, we need to configure our SDI video output. These settings all live under Project Settings in the Master Settings tab. Because all Dolby Vision monitoring is full range, we need to explicitly select Full under Data Levels. For the best video quality in HDR, we'll also enable 444 SDI and choose a bit depth of 12-bit. If your hardware only supports 10-bit 444 or even 422, you can still achieve great results in HDR delivered in Dolby Vision. However, you may find certain scenes are compromised by the reduction in image bit depth and color subsampling. In a later video, you'll see us use the internal CMU in Resolve. If you're using the internal CMU and have an I/O device with two SDI outputs, you can check this option for Use Dual Outputs on SDI to see the HDR signal on one output and the tone-mapped SDR or lower nit level HDR signal on the second output simultaneously. Lastly, there's an option specific to DaVinci Resolve for Enable HDR metadata over HDMI. We don't need to enable that, since we'll be using SDI monitoring. Now that we have our video output set up, we need to configure our project's color management settings. Now keep in mind, this example is specific to Resolve, but your grading software should have similar color management tools and settings available. Inside the color management page, the first thing we need to do is enable a color managed project by switching color science to DaVinci YRGB Color Managed. Once we have color management enabled, we can set up our color management settings. When working in Dolby Vision and Resolve, it's best to enable Use Separate Color Space and Gamma, so you can specify exactly what color space, gamut, and transfer function you need for that specific project.
Now, you also need to know exactly what your client expects for a deliverable. Dolby Vision can work in both P3 or Rec 2020 color spaces. And right now, there are no 100% capable Rec 2020 monitors. So you might ask yourself, why should I use Rec 2020? Well, many distributors may still ask for a deliverable in Rec 2020 color space. And it's good to understand that the color gamut that you master to and the color space you deliver in can be different. We can set our output color space to Rec 2020, but limit our mastering color gamut to P3 D65. In other words, we master the HDR project with a color gamut of P3, but deliver that P3 color gamut within a Rec 2020 container if required.
So those are the settings we need to adjust next. Input color space defines the default transform applied to your source footage. This can be useful as a starting point for your grade, but if you want no transform applied, simply select bypass. Since we're using red RAW files, Resolve is going to ignore this setting anyway, and debayer those RAW files into our timeline color space by default. If you're using a non-RAW source, you can select a default input transform here. So for example, if your show was shot on S-Log2, we could set that to be the default and all clips will be interpreted as S-Log2. And if you have multiple source formats, you can always override this setting on a clip-by-clip basis if needed. Next, we need to select the timeline color space. This governs both the gamut available and how the color controls behave. For color space, I'm going to choose P3 D65, and for gamma, I'll choose ST2084, which is the PQ curve. Now, an important thing to understand is that even though Resolve has different nit levels listed here, they're all going to output a PQ image. These different levels simply allow you to specify a maximum brightness that Resolve will limit your signal to, so you can avoid grading at a brighter level than your monitor can display. If you don't want Resolve to do any clipping, and rather let your display handle that, select ST2084 with no nit level specified. Finally, we need to choose our output color space in gamma. This determines the color space of our final output. I'm going to set the gamma to ST2084, and for color space, I can select either P3 D65 or Rec 2020. If I need to make a P3 deliverable, I would select P3 D65. Now, if the client requires a Rec 2020 deliverable that's limited to P3 gamut, you can select P3 D65 under Limit Output Gamut to clip the final output to P3.
So in this configuration, we're having Resolve debayer our raw clips right into P3 and ST2084 and grading from there. That's one way of grading in PQ, but not the only way. For example, sometimes you might want to keep your timeline set to the native color space of your source footage, grade in that color space, and have the output color space settings handle the transform into PQ. Just keep in mind, there's no one-size-fits-all color management setting that will be best for every project. So it always helps to do some testing before you commit to a particular workflow. Now that our color management is set up, next we need to enable Dolby Vision.
The version setting selects the version of Dolby Vision we want to use. We're going to choose 4.0. If you need to deliver an older version 2.9, you can create a 2.9 mezzanine file from a Dolby Vision 4.0 master. You can also select version 2.9 to create a version 2.9 within Resolve.
Dolby continues to evolve and create new features in Dolby Vision. The specs from your client should hopefully include the version of Dolby Vision they want delivered. Many times, this is dependent on the method of distribution.
Now, we need to select our mastering display. For this project, I'll select 4000 nit P3 D65 ST2084 full. If we were delivering a Rec 2020 grade, limited to P3 gamut, we would select 4000 nit BT 2020 instead.
Now, you might be wondering why we're choosing 4000 nits here when we're using a 3000 nit monitor. At the time of this recording, there isn't a 3000 nit choice in this list. Our mastering monitor was just released and a 3000 nit option has not yet been added. Choosing the 4000 nit option allows us to use the full potential of this mastering display. When grading, we'll just need to keep an eye on the scopes to ensure that we're not pushing the signal too far.
If you're using a Dolby external CMU, you can enable external CMU and select which CMU to use. Currently, the eCMU only works with Dolby Vision 2.9, so since we're using 4.0, that option is grayed out. If you're using the internal CMU, just leave this turned off. eCMU support for version 4.0 is coming in a future update. Now that our color management is configured, the last thing we want to do is go into the system-wide preferences and enable HDR scopes. This changes the internal scope views to show levels in actual nit values, so you can see exactly where your grade is sitting in real-world light levels.
Once your color management and video output settings are configured, you're ready to start grading in HDR. Just make sure that whatever the specific requirements of your project are, that your HDR mastering monitor is also set up to match. For example, if you're outputting P3, your monitor needs to be configured for P3 color space. If you're outputting Rec 2020, configure your monitor for Rec 2020 instead.
And remember, as time passes and software evolves, these pull-downs are likely to change, and one set of color management settings won't be right for every single project or workflow. But the concepts you've learned so far in this series and the specific deliverables required by your client should help guide you to the right combinations of settings for your project's needs. Now that your project is set up, in the next video, you'll learn how to configure and use the Dolby Content Mapping Unit, or CMU.